look to find the roots of behavior? Are we born a blank slate and then taught everything we know? Or do we enter the world with some inclination, some innate stirrings, some idea of what to look for and how to act? For evolutionary psychologists, the answers to some of the most fundamental questions of nature versus nurture may be found in our evolutionary history. Darwin's theory of natural selection has been the organizing principle in biology for a long time. In psychology, too, Darwin's evolutionary principles can help explain human behavior.
So the basics of the Darwinian theory are that we're not all the same. At any point in time, for any given species, different individuals in the species vary, and the variations may be better or worse fits to the environment in which they happen to live. The organisms who happen to have features that are particularly good fits to their environment, the environment has nuts and berries that are hard to get to, and they've got big long beaks of their birds, they're more likely to survive and reproduce. So that organism doesn't change, but the population of organisms changes because an organism with a particular feature is more likely to have offspring, and after a few generations of that, the population shifts so that the feature that worked in that environment becomes the dominant feature for the species. And so the species across generations kind of shifts in its features through a process that Darwin called natural selection. The core idea for evolutionary psychology is that evolution gives us certain capacities or perhaps mechanisms. They don't necessarily give us a tendency to do a behavior over and over, but a capacity to do a behavior in a particular kind of setting.
Two of the most powerful tools of evolutionary psychology are the studies of homology and analogy. A homology is a similarity that exists between two species because of their common ancestry. For example, the color vision we share with our ape ancestors.
An evolutionary analysis does a couple things. One of them is to point out that, of course, since humans were something else and evolved in an evolution of species, it might be that there is something analogous between a human behavior and some other species. As one simple example, social organizations, in the human case, commonly are hierarchical. That process in which there's a social group that's organized seems not at all like something that developed, sprung out of the brain of human beings over the past few thousand years, but is so closely analogous to what you see in the case of our related ancestor apes.
An analogy is any similarity that stems not from common ancestry, but from two different species because of some similarity in their habitats or lifestyle, involving a common characteristic independent of one another. For example, the wings of birds and insects are analogous. These species adapted to fly through different evolutionary paths. So wing structure did not evolve from a common ancestor, but rather through independent adaptation, making it an analogy. Something that intrigues evolutionary psychologists is the phenomenon of helping one another, or being altruistic. The answer as to why we see altruistic behavior across species is packaged into two theories: the kin selection theory and the reciprocity theory. The reciprocity theory provides an account of how acts of altruism can arise.
What evolutionary psychology does is to tell us that A, it's not irrational to be altruistic, and B, one doesn't need to explain it in terms of a contemporary moral code because it may be kind of wired in for evolutionary reasons. Then you ask, why would that be wired in? One is that the behavior that's altruistic today may be paid off through behavior that benefits you tomorrow. There may be reciprocity. The second possibility is that the altruistic act, if directed towards relatives or kin, pays off in terms of the survival of the genetic lineage. Your family, your collection of genes is in good shape if your altruistic act saves 2 sisters and 3 brothers and 4 children. They all survive at the cost of you, but across the course of evolution, if you imagine genes trying to survive, then altruism is doing that survival for you. You're paying off the kin and the genetic system in the long run through your own altruistic act.
Altruism is just one example of the implications of studying behavior through the lens of evolutionary psychology. The same techniques of cross-species analysis and evolutionary probing have led to important hypotheses about gender differences, mating patterns, and aggression, among other traits.
Given that those differences occur as a natural feature of human biology, it may be that for men and women, there are different kinds of behaviors that make most sense. The evolutionary psychology argument is that if women are particularly burdened with the cost of pregnancy, then when looking for mates, they will be particularly attuned to mates who can help out with those burdens, who will be financially successful. And then the predictions of evolutionary psychology is that the possession of financial resources in the game of mating are going to be extremely important for men in attracting women, but not as much vice versa, and that's not a learned contemporary thing. That reflects our evolutionary heritage.
The usefulness of evolutionary psychology is in its ability to generate hypotheses about current behaviors by looking at the past as our greatest source of insight into the present. But we must also be wary of some of the potential pitfalls of the evolutionary approach to psychology.
Evolutionary psychology often explains why in a particular situation a particular kind of behavior occurs, because evolutionarily that paid off. However, much of psychology involves other questions that just aren't touched by the evolutionary psychologist. For example, much of everyday behavior involves figuring out the situation you're in the first place. Are these people your friends or not? Are they useful mates if you're trying to date? Or are they not? Often there's a lot of ambiguities to life. So the trick for evolutionary psychology, that is the challenge, is to figure out whether the story about natural selection and behavior was one that is actually mapping onto that long ago process, or is some misplaced story because the behavior really was a kind of quirky thing that doesn't deserve to have a natural selection story in the first place.
The insights of evolutionary psychology are not end-all explanations. They are frameworks and organizing principles through which we can begin to answer some of the deepest questions of human behavior.